Okay, everyone, today we are going to talk about pedigrees and genetic disorders. Pedigrees are like big family trees that show us how different traits are passed in a family. And so, most often, we use these to show how different genetic diseases are passed. This is a way that scientists show that. However, you can also show traits, anything that is passed from parent to offspring, you can show in a pedigree. And so a pedigree is a series of symbols that represent males and females and affected and unaffected individuals. And it's just a lot easier to read the symbolic pattern because you can see a lot of different generations of family members at one time. And you can start to see patterns that might arise in certain families and certain traits that they're seeing in a family. And so this pedigree that I'm showing you on this page right here, this is actually a pedigree of a family in Colombia that has a specific type of Alzheimer's disease. And the really impressive thing about this family is the records that they've kept. And so they're able to understand a lot about this family's disease because they can trace their family records back all the way to 1745. So there are a couple kinds of genetic disorders. Some will be autosomal, some will be sex-linked, and they can be dominant or recessive. And so we'll kind of look at examples of all these types. So Huntington's disease is a disease where a person's brain tissue starts to disintegrate over time, and that can lead to different problems in function and eventually death. And so this is caused by an abnormal dominant allele, which is kind of different than most genetic disorders. A majority of them are caused by recessive alleles. But because it is a dominant disorder, that means you need only one copy of the Huntington's allele to get that disease. Cystic fibrosis is another example of a genetic disorder that is passed from parent to offspring, but this is an autosomal recessive disorder. And so because it's autosomal recessive, that means that someone needs 2 copies of this mutant allele to have cystic fibrosis. And so cystic fibrosis is a disease of the lungs where there's a buildup of mucus inside the lungs, which can lead to bacterial infection and illness, and eventually it can just be really hard on the lungs of these people. And so it's caused by a mutation in a receptor protein. And about 1 in 2,500 babies are born with CF in the United States every year. So karyotypes are pictures of chromosomes. And so a karyotype just takes a person's chromosome and lines them up into homologous pairs to see to make sure that there is a copy from mom and a copy from dad for each chromosome that is found. And so some genetic disorders can be caused by too many usually too many of a particular chromosome. And this occurs because of errors in meiosis. And so there are a lot of examples of genetic disorders that have to do with chromosome number abnormalities. But some common ones are Down syndrome, in which you have 3 copies of the 21st chromosome, Patau syndrome, which would be 3 copies of chromosome 13. There's trisomy 18, which is 3 copies of the 18th chromosome. And then there are also different genetic diseases that include too many of the sex chromosomes. And so an example of this would be Klinefelter's syndrome, where there's an extra X for a male. So they're XXY instead of just XY. There's also Turner syndrome. That's XO, meaning that a female is born with just a single X chromosome. There's a trisomy X, where a female is born with 3 X chromosomes. So there can be a lot of these different diseases that are associated with the sex chromosomes as well. Okay, so moving on to pedigrees, we're going to talk about how we build a pedigree and what the different symbols mean. And so pedigrees are that graphic representation of how a trait is passed. And so here are some tips for writing a pedigree, and this is something that you need to write down on your paper. So our first tip is that circles are for females. So anytime that you see a circle on a pedigree, that is going to code for female. And then anytime you see a square on a pedigree, that is going to code for a male. And then if there is a horizontal line that connects two people, that means that there's some type of union between those people that resulted in offspring. So usually when we say a union, we mean a marriage. And so a horizontal line means marriage or a union, and then a vertical line with a bracket on it would represent the offspring from that union. And so in this example right here, we have a male and female who produced 3 offspring, 2 males and a female. If a symbol is shaded in, like this square is right here, that would indicate the person has whatever trait you're talking about. So this could be, cystic fibrosis, or it could be that that person has a widow's peak, or, it can really mean anything. It just means that that person has the trait that this certain pedigree is talking about. If it's not shaded in, like the circle right here, that represents an individual who does not have the trait. And so, we don't know if that, all we know about that person is that they don't have the trait. And then sometimes on pedigrees, you'll see this kind of partial or half shade, and that would indicate someone who is heterozygous. So someone who's maybe a carrier of that trait, or a heterozygous individual that has different alleles for that trait. But I would say that seeing that half shaded circle or square is less common. It's more common just to have shaded and non-shaded. Okay, so we are going to do our own pedigree case study. And so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to flip your page over as we work through this story of the Blue people of Troublesome Creek. And so we're going to listen to this story about this family, which is a true story about a real live family who lived in Kentucky. And these people had blue skin. And so these people had blue skin because of a certain genetic disorder where they didn't hold on to iron in their blood as well as normal individuals. And so that caused their skin to kind of have a blue tone to it. Okay, so we are going to read this story. And as we read it, we are going to draw the pedigree of the Fugate family. So Martin Fugate was an orphan who moved to Kentucky in 1820 to find a place to live near Troublesome Creek. Family stories say that Martin himself was blue. The odds were very much against it, but Martin Fugate managed to find and marry a woman who carried the same recessive gene. His wife, Elizabeth, carried 1 copy of the blue gene, but her skin was white as snow. Okay, so to start this pedigree, we need to draw a symbol for Martin, and we need to draw a symbol for his wife, Elizabeth. So to do that, we're going to make a square for Martin, and then we're going to make a circle for Elizabeth. And so because this ends up being a really big family pedigree, we're going to put the names of the individuals over their symbols. And so here we have Martin, and then we're just going to call Elizabeth Liz to kind of shorten that up. Okay, and so Martin and Liz are married, so we're going to draw a horizontal line between them. And then Martin himself was blue. And so if we're tracking this blue trait through this family, we are going to color Martin in blue. And so this says that the blue gene is a recessive gene, that his wife Elizabeth carried the recessive gene, but she wasn't blue. So that means that we can assign some genotypes to these people because we're aware of what their genes say. And so we're going to use the letter B. So little b will stand for someone who's blue, and a big B will stand for non-blue. So Martin is going to be little b because he is an affected blue person. And his wife Liz, who is not blue, we know, has a capital B, but it says that she carries a recessive gene, so that would make her a heterozygote. So Martin is little b, and Liz is big B, little b. Okay, so Martin and Elizabeth began a family. Of their 7 children, 3 girls and 4 boys, they had 2 blue daughters and 2 blue sons. Okay, so now we're going to draw the children of Martin and Liz. And so we're going to draw a pretty big bracket here because Martin and Liz have a lot of kids. So they had 7 children, and they had 4 boys and 3 girls. So we would need to draw 4 squares and 3 circles. And so 2 of the daughters were blue. So we'll need to shade in 2 of these circles blue. And then 2 of their sons were blue. So we'll have to shade in 2 of these sons as being blue. And so based on the information we know, we should be able to tell the genotypes of all these children. And so the blue ones are really easy, right? They all are going to be little b because they all have that recessive blue trait. And their siblings who are not blue, we know, have a capital B. But we know that all of these 3 non-blue siblings could only have received a little b from their dad, Martin. So we know that makes each of them a heterozygous. And so there's Martin, Liz, and their 7 children. Now, because we have more than one generation in this pedigree now, we are able to label the generations. And so when you label generations in a pedigree, usually it's off to the left side, and you just start at the top and work your way down. So Martin and Liz, they'll be generation 1, and then their children will be generation 2. And as we go through this pedigree, we'll just keep adding generations. So Zach was one of their favorite sons, and he was blue, okay? So we're just going to we'll just use this last one to represent Zach. He married Rachel, his mother's sister, which was more common way back in the day than you think. And they had 3 non-blue children, 1 boy and 2 girls. So a boy, and a girl. And they were all non-blue. And so we'll label Rachel with her name. And so all of their children are not blue. So we know all of them have a capital B. But because their father was blue, we would know that each of them has a lowercase b because they were only able to get a lowercase b from their dad. Now, Rachel, Zach's wife, we know she has a capital B, but we're not really sure about her other allele because we don't really know anything else about the family besides that her sister was a carrier, but we don't know anything about their parents. And so for her other allele, we would just have to put a question mark because we don't really know if that other allele is a capital B or a lowercase b. And so this generation would be the 3rd generation. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so here is our generations. I'm just going to quickly label the generations here so we don't forget them. Okay, and so this is Martin, remember, and then these are 2 of his blue sons and his 2 blue daughters. And so this is his son Zach and Zach's wife Rachel, and then these are their 3 kids that were not blue. And so if we remember from previous, we knew that all of their kids were big B, little b, because Zach himself was big B, little b. So this is Zach and Rachel. I'm just quickly labeling this since you guys already have this on your paper. Okay, so Levi, a non-blue, was one of Zach's sons. So we'll label this guy Levi. And so Levi married a girl named Sarah. So Sarah is this circle right here who has a horizontal line with Levi. And they bought a large farm. The couple had 3 children, including Luna, the only blue. Okay, so we are going to draw their 3 children. I think they had all daughters. And so there are their 3 children. And then they had Luna. We'll label her here. And she is blue. Okay? And so that tells us, right, that Luna's genotype has to be little b, little b. And then this also tells us Sarah's phenotype. So Sarah has to be heterozygous so that she could donate one of those little b's to Luna. And so the siblings we're not 100% sure about, right? They could be big B, or big B, little b, but we don't really know. So we would put question marks next to them. And so as it turns out, the girl that Levi married had Fugate blood in her family 4 generations back. In fact, her great-grandfather's brother was Martin Fugate's grandfather. So that makes sense that Sarah would be carrying that little b. And so Luna's generation, we're going to label 4 because she's the next generation. Okay, let's keep going. Okay. Okay, so we left off at Luna. Remember, she's little b, little b. Okay, so a fellow by the name of John spotted Luna at Sunday services of the old regular Baptist church back before the century turned. So this square right here that I want you to draw in with Luna will represent John. And so John dated her and married her. And Luna was healthy like most blue people. And she had 3 kids. So Luna has 3 boys that we are going to draw in with squares. And so she has a son, Steve. Oh, I didn't mean to color him blue. She has a son, Steve. And Steve married a local girl named Susie. And they had 3 non-blue kids, including, they had 3 non-blue kids, including Alva. So this will be Alva. Okay, so Steve and Susie are generation 5, and Alva is generation 6. And so As the railroads changed Kentucky, the blue people started moving around and marrying other people, and the strain of blue began to disappear as the recessive allele spread to families where it was unlikely to be paired with another copy. Not too long back, Alva found himself a bride in a local woman named Hilda, and the two had a son named Benji. So Alva is going to marry Hilda, and they will have a son named Benji. And Benji popped out blue. Okay, so you can see they had a couple generations with no blue, and then finally down here in the 7th generation, they have Benji, who's blue, which means that Benji is little b, which would make both of his parents heterozygous because each of them had to donate a little b to Benji. And so that tells us that Steve is big B, little b, because Luna was his mom, and so Luna had to pass on a little b to him and all of his siblings, which would make all of his siblings heterozygous. And then Susie, Steve's wife, we're not really sure about. So we know she has a big B, but we don't really know about her other allele, so we'd have to put a question mark there. And so at this point, I think we've filled out this pedigree about as good as we can. We've filled out everything that we can tell about it, all the genotypes that we can tell. We have all the symbols right. We have their names on it when they've given names. Names is not something you need to put on the pedigree, but sometimes it might help you keep who's who straight, especially based on, if it's a really long one like this. So that's the blue people's story. Okay, so obviously you're not going to do this with your table partner, but we'll just talk through the answers to some of these questions. So how many individuals have blue skin in the 7 generations shown in the pedigree? So to figure that out, we need to count all of the individuals who are shaded in. So in this case, we have 1 in generation 1. We have 4 in generation 2, which would make 5. We have none in generation 3. In generation 4, we have another, which is 6. In generation 5, we have no one. In generation 6, we have no one. But in generation 7, that's where we get our 7th person. So that would be 7 individuals. Okay, so number 2, if in generation 6, which would be Alva and Hilda's generation, if the second individual married someone who is not a carrier of the blue people allele, what is the probability that their kids would be blue? So here, when we label people, sometimes we can label individuals and give them numbers like 1 and 2. And so if the second individual is Hilda, if she married someone who was not a carrier of the blue allele, what is the probability their kids will be blue? So she was big B, little b. If she marries someone who's big B, that's going to give them children who all have a capital B. So they would have a 0 out of 4 or 0% chance of their kids being blue. Do we notice a pattern in the pedigree? I would say that, it begins to start skipping generations. Not at the beginning, but then towards the end, like generations 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, you start to see less and less blue, which would indicate that it is like a recessive pattern. And so what are the genotypes of the parents in the first generation? We already figured that out. They were little b, and big B, little b. And then why are Martin and Elizabeth's kids either carriers or blue people? Well, that's because of Martin, because Martin is little b. So when he passes on to his children, he's either giving them a little b and Elizabeth will give them a little b to be blue, or he'll give them a little b and Elizabeth will give them a capital B to be a carrier. And so that's why all of his children are either carriers or blue people. So that is it for our pedigree notes. We'll do some practice with a worksheet and we'll do some practices with a case study.